The moment Adelaide Bailey stood up in the middle of the Caldwell town meeting and said she believed women ought to own property in their own names, the laughter started before she even finished her sentence. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell, Kansas was a town still finding its bones, still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. The cattle drives thundered through its main street every few months, leaving behind dust and money and men with rough hands and rougher manners. The town had a bank, a general store, a church that was half finished, a saloon that was completely finished, and a set of opinions about women that were about as flexible as the iron rails of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad cutting through the prairie just south of town. Adelaide was 24 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with a stubborn set to her jaw that her mother had always called unfortunate, and her late father had always called magnificent. She had come to the meeting with a folded piece of paper in her apron pocket, on which she had written down 3 proposals she thought the town council should consider. The first was about property rights for women. The second was about establishing a lending library. The third was about building a proper schoolhouse, since the children of Caldwell were currently being educated in the back room of the feed store, which smelled powerfully of grain and mouse droppings. She had thought them through carefully. She had spent 3 evenings writing them out and revising them by lamplight. She had rehearsed what she would say while hanging the washing and while kneading bread and while lying awake listening to the coyotes call across the dark prairie. None of that preparation made the laughter any easier to bear. Hector Drummond, who owned the hardware store and considered himself the unofficial voice of masculine reason in Caldwell, wiped a tear from his eye and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "There goes Adelaide Bailey, dreaming again." And the room chuckled. Even some of the women in the back row looked at their shoes. Town Councilman Gerald Pratt, a man with the expression of someone permanently disappointed by life, said, with a patience that was itself a form of condescension, "Miss Bailey, these are very imaginative ideas, but perhaps you might leave the governing of the town to those with experience in such matters." Adelaide felt heat climb into her face. She felt the paper in her pocket. She felt 20 pairs of eyes doing various degrees of nothing, which was somehow worse than outright hostility. She looked around the room at the stovepipe hats and the calico bonnets and the oil lamp throwing trembling yellow light across all of it, and she thought, very clearly and very quietly inside herself, "I am not wrong. I am just early." She sat down without another word. She held herself straight because she had learned that from her father, who had said that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. She did not cry until she was outside in the dark, with the spring wind coming off the prairie carrying the smell of new grass and distant rain. And even then, she only let herself have 3 deep, shaking breaths before she pressed her knuckles against her eyes and started walking home. She did not notice the man leaning against the post of the feed store across the road, smoking a quiet cigarette, watching with an expression she could not have read even if she had seen it, which was something between recognition and a particular kind of anger on her behalf. His name was Matthew Langston, and he had ridden into Caldwell 4 days ago with a letter of employment from the Hartley Cattle Company, which had hired him to manage a section of their grazing land 7 miles north of town. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with green eyes that missed very little and hands that showed the evidence of a life lived mostly outdoors. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas and had spent the last 10 years working cattle drives up the Kisham Trail, which meant he had seen about every kind of human behavior there was, and had developed a precise and unsentimental view of which behaviors deserved his respect and which ones did not. He had wandered into the town meeting out of something between curiosity and boredom. Small town meetings were their own kind of theater, in his experience. He had planned to stay for 20 minutes and then go back to his rented room at the boarding house. He had not planned on watching a woman stand up and say 3 reasonable, clear-headed things and get laughed out of the room for it. He tossed the end of his cigarette into the dirt and watched Adelaide Bailey walk away down the dark road with her back straight and her chin level. And he thought that was one of the bravest things he had seen in a good while. And he had once watched a man face down a rattlesnake with a pocket knife. He did not follow her. That would have been inappropriate, and he knew it. But he remembered her face. The next day Adelaide was behind the counter of the Bailey dry goods store, which her father had built, and which she now ran alone since his death 2 years ago. The store was small and tidy and smelled of coffee and dried beans, and the faint ghost of her father's pipe tobacco that never quite left the wooden walls no matter how many times she aired the place out. She had learned the business from him thoroughly, every ledger column and every supplier and every price negotiation, and she ran it competently, which the town acknowledged with their commerce if not always with their respect. She was measuring out flour when the bell above the door rang and Matthew Langston walked in. He took off his hat when he came through the door, which she noticed because not everyone did. He looked around the store with the unhurried attention of a man who actually sees things, and then he came to the counter and set down a list. "Morning," he said. "I need to put together a supply order for the Hartley Range house. Been told you're the place to do it." "I am," Adelaide said. She looked at his list. It was written clearly and organized by category, which was also something she noticed because not everyone did that either. "I can have most of this ready by tomorrow afternoon. The dried beef and the lamp oil I have now." "That's fine," he said. He paused. "You were at the town meeting last night." She looked up. I was too," he said. "In the back." She waited for whatever came next. It was usually something like, "You ought not to take it personally," or "You have to understand how things are done," or some variation of the idea that she should be smaller and quieter and more patient about being dismissed. Matthew Langston said those were good proposals, all 3 of them. She stared at him for a moment. "I beg your pardon. The property rights, the library, the school," he said, as if he had paid attention, as if he had actually listened. "They made sense. I don't know why half the room thought they were funny." Adelaide set down her flour scoop very carefully. "Because I was the one saying them," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's the problem with the room," he said, "not with the ideas." She did not know what to say to that. In 24 years of living in Caldwell, Kansas, she could not remember anyone outside her own father saying something like that to her in that particular direct and uncomplicated way. "Matthew Langston," he said, and put out his hand. "Adelaide Bailey," she said, and shook it. "I'll come back tomorrow for the order," he said, and put his hat on and went back out into the Kansas sunshine. Adelaide stood behind her counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and felt something she could not immediately name, something that was adjacent to hope and adjacent to caution, and entirely its own thing in the space between them. She filled out his supply list with very precise measurements. He came back the next afternoon as promised, and while she tallied his account he asked her, with a genuine curiosity she was not accustomed to, about how she had come to run the store herself. She told him briefly about her father's death, and the way the business had simply needed someone to take it over, so she had taken it over. She expected the usual response, which was some variation of admiration wrapped in pity. Instead he said, "Do you like it? Running a store?" The question surprised her. "Parts of it," she said honestly. "I like the ordering and the accounting. I like knowing exactly what the town needs and making sure it's there. I'm less fond of being treated as though I stumbled into the job accidentally." "What would you do," he said, "if you could do anything?" It was such a strange question that she almost laughed. "Almost? I'd open a lending library," she said, "which I already told the whole town council last Tuesday, and you can see how that went." "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "What rest of it?" "You had 3 proposals," he said. "I heard them, that's one. What were the others besides the school?" She looked at him across the counter. He was leaning on it slightly, not in a lounging way but in the way of a man who is actually settling in to listen to something, the way you settle in to hear something worth hearing. "The school is the most urgent," she said. "There are 42 children in this town being educated in a feed store. I want a proper building with proper desks and a teacher who gets paid a proper salary." She paused. "And beyond all that, I want to write." "Write what?" "Everything," she said, and the word came out with more force than she intended, the way water comes out when you have been holding a bucket too long. "Stories about this place. About the people who actually built it, not just the ones who show up in newspapers. The laundresses and the seamstresses and the cattle drovers and the sodbusters. The way the light looks on the prairie in October. The way a cattle drive sounds when it's still 3 miles away and you can feel it in the ground before you hear it. All of it." She stopped. She had not said that much in one stretch to anyone in quite some time. Matthew Langston had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but it was not amusement, and it was not condescension, and it was not the particular glazed patience of a man waiting for a woman to finish so he can change the subject. "That sounds worth doing," he said. She picked up her pen and pretended to check his receipt for errors. "Most people think it sounds like foolishness." "Most people," he said, "are looking at the ground when they walk, makes them good at not tripping. Doesn't make them right about everything." He picked up his supplies, paid his account to the penny, and said he would see her next week when he came in for more provisions. He put his hat on at the door and went out, and Adelaide watched through the front window as he loaded his horse with calm, efficient movements, and she thought that was a very curious man, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. The weeks that followed brought him back to the store with the regular rhythm of a working man's needs, and gradually, the supply transactions began to stretch, the way conversations do when two people discover they fit together in some manner neither of them expected. He asked her questions, and he listened to the answers, which was a combination Adelaide had rarely encountered. He told her things, too, about his years on the cattle trails, about Texas in the summer, and what it was like to sleep under a sky so big it felt like a physical thing pressing down on you, about the particular satisfaction of honest work and the particular frustration of watching other men get credit for it. He was not a man who talked for the pleasure of hearing himself, she decided. He talked because he had things to say. That was different. One afternoon in late April, she was in the middle of telling him about a letter she had received from a woman's journal in Chicago that had asked to publish a piece she had sent them on speculation, her first ever submission, and her voice had been careful and controlled, because she was a person who had learned to manage her own excitement the way you manage a lantern in wind, keeping the flame small so it does not blow out. But Matthew heard it anyway, the brightness she was trying to keep contained. "They want to publish it," he said. "They do," she said. He grinned then, a full, wide grin that did something significant to the arrangement of his face, and also, she discovered, to her ability to concentrate. "That's wonderful," he said, and he said it without any qualifications or gentle warnings about not getting too pleased with herself, the way people who meant well often added those in. "It is," she said, and let herself smile back at him properly for the first time. He came to the store one Thursday in early May when the prairie wind was doing what it did in May, which was blow hard enough to make you reconsider everything you thought you knew about stillness, and he found her in the back with a ledger spread across her work table and a look on her face that he had learned to recognize as the particular expression of someone fighting down frustration. "What happened?" he said. She looked up. She had stopped being surprised that he could read her that clearly. "Gerald Pratt has decided the town does not need a lending library because, and I am quoting him exactly, there are not enough people in Caldwell who have finished reading the books they already own." Matthew pulled up the stool she kept near the work table and sat on it. "What are you going to do about it?" "I am going to open one anyway," she said. He looked at her. "In here." She had not actually said that out loud yet. She had been thinking it for 2 weeks, and it had been sitting in her chest like a stone she was deciding whether to put down or throw. "There's a back room," she said slowly. "My father used it for storage. It is not enormous, but it is there, and it has a window." "You'd need books," he said. "I have books," she said. "I have been collecting them for 6 years. I have 41. She paused. "That is not very many." "You could ask people to donate," he said, Or loan, people might have books sitting in trunks they'd be glad to see used. She stared at him. You are taking this very seriously. Why wouldn't I? Because everyone else thinks it is an impractical dream with no real purpose. He leaned forward on the stool with his forearms on his knees, the way he sat when he was thinking something through properly, and he looked at her very directly and said, Adelaide, tell me every single dream you have. The room went quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the building and the sign above the store creaked on its bracket, and somewhere down the road a horse stamped. And in the back of the Bailey dry goods store, Adelaide Bailey felt the floor shift slightly under her feet, the way it sometimes does when something changes that you cannot quite name yet. What? She said, though she had heard him perfectly. Every one, he said. The library, the writing, the school, whatever else, tell me all of it. I want to hear it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with the green eyes and the sunburned hands and the particular quality of stillness that made you feel you could say actual things, and they would be received as actual things. And then she talked. She talked for longer than she had talked to anyone in years. She told him about the library and exactly how she would organize it and what she would call it, and the sign she had already sketched in the back of one of her ledgers. She told him about the school and the curriculum she had outlined, and the woman she knew in Wichita who had her teaching certificate and might be persuaded to come to Caldwell for the right salary. She told him about the writing, not just the piece the journal had bought, but the larger thing she was building, a record of this town and this time, and these people who were building something real out of grass and hope and stubbornness. She told him about the smaller dreams too, the ones she had never said out loud to anyone because they seemed too small to defend. That she wanted a garden with something other than vegetables in it. That she wanted to learn to ride a horse properly instead of just perched on a wagon seat. That she wanted to sit on a porch someday and hear someone reading aloud, and that she wanted that someday to be not very far away. When she finished, her throat was dry and her hands were slightly unsteady, and she felt simultaneously exposed and strangely lighter, as if the speaking of things removed some of their weight. Matthew Langston sat on the stool and looked at her with that steadiness of his, and he said, "The teaching certificate woman in Wichita, what's stopping you from writing her?" "I have no authority to hire a teacher," Adelaide said. "The school board decides that." "You could petition the school board," he said. "You're good at proposals. You've got one good one written already. Write another." "The school board is Gerald Pratt and two men who agree with whatever Gerald Pratt says." "Then you need a fourth voice on that board," he said. "Is there a way to get a fourth member?" She blinked. "There is a provision in the town charter for the board to expand. I looked it up when my father was on it." "So you petitioned to expand the board," he said. "You find 2 or 3 people in town who agree with you, which I suspect is not impossible if you look past the town meeting crowd. You get them to nominate a fourth member. You make noise in the right places." She was quiet for a moment. "You think like a man who has managed large things," she said. "I've managed cattle drives," he said. "Which is mostly a matter of knowing where the pressure points are and dealing with them before they become problems. I am not a cattle drive." "No," he said, and something in his voice went softer. "You are not." It was a small moment and a large one at the same time, and they both felt it, and neither of them said anything further about it, and that was exactly right. 3 days later, Adelaide wrote to Margaret Hoskins in Wichita, who had her certificate from the Kansas State Normal School, and who Adelaide had met at a church gathering 2 years ago, and who had seemed like a woman with sense and patience, both of which were necessary for teaching and for dealing with Caldwell's school board. The letter was careful and specific and honest about the situation, including the feed store, and she sent it without knowing what would come back. In the meantime, she began clearing out the back room of the store. Matthew showed up on a Saturday morning with a wheelbarrow and no particular explanation, and helped her move 6 years' worth of accumulated crates and old furniture and various objects her father had stored with the intention of getting around to them, which he never had. They worked for 4 hours in the dusty back room, opening the single window to let in the May air, sweeping out the corners, discovering that under the clutter the floor was solid plank, and the walls were in good order. When the room was empty and clean, they stood in it together and looked at the window letting in a rectangle of prairie light, and Adelaide thought that it looked almost exactly like what she had imagined in those lamplit evenings of planning, and the feeling of that was so acute she had to press her hand against the wall for a moment. "It's a good room," Matthew said. "It is," she said. He looked at her sideways. There was a streak of dust across her cheekbone, and she was not remotely concerned about it, which he found he had strong feelings about in the direction of admiration. "You all right?" he said. "I am," she said. "I am also not quite used to things actually happening." "They happen when you make them happen," he said. "That is easy to say," she said, not harshly but honestly. "It is harder when the town has spent several years telling you that the things you want to make happen are impractical and foolish." He was quiet for a moment. "Who told you they were foolish, besides Pratt?" she shrugged. "My mother a bit," she worried, "people in town, the usual." She paused. "There was a man I was almost engaged to 3 years ago, Daniel Westcott. He told me I needed to stop filling my head with plans that were above my station and concentrate on building a proper life." "Where is Daniel Westcott now?" Matthew said. "Topeka," she said. "He married a woman named Clara who I gather is very well organized and sensible and does not have plans above her station." "Then Daniel Westcott is a fool," Matthew said, with such quiet certainty that it startled a laugh out of her. "That is a very strong opinion about someone you've never met," she said. "I have a strong opinion about any man who tells a woman to stop thinking," he said. "I formed it a long time ago, and I have not found any reason to change it." She looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway of the back room with the light from the store coming over his shoulder and the light from the window in front of him, and she thought, "This is a good man." She thought it as simply and clearly as she had ever thought anything. "Matthew," she said. "Adelaide," he said. They stood in the cleared room in the May afternoon and looked at each other, and the air between them was full of something that was not quite ready to be spoken yet but was very definitely there, like a storm you can see coming from 3 miles out across flat land. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for the wheelbarrow. I'll come back Monday and help you put up shelves if you want them," he said. "I want them," she said. He nodded and picked up the wheelbarrow and went back out through the store into the Saturday afternoon, and Adelaide stood in her empty, clean back room and pressed both hands flat against the wall and breathed slowly until the feeling in her chest settled into something she could carry. The shelves went up Monday. Adelaide's neighbor, Mrs. Dora Thacker, a widow of 62 who had been watching everything with bright, sharp eyes from behind her lace curtains, came over on Tuesday with 11 books wrapped in a cloth sack and set them on the new shelves herself. "I have been waiting for someone to do this for 8 years, Mrs. Thacker said. "Do not let Gerald Pratt tell you that you cannot." "He already told me I cannot," Adelaide said. "Then ignore him," Mrs. Thacker said, "which is what the sensible people in this town have been doing about Gerald Pratt for 15 years. Word moved through Caldwell the way word moved through all small places, which was rapidly and with modification. By the end of the week, people were coming into the store with books to donate. By the end of the second week, Adelaide had 93 books on the shelves. She made a card catalog in a recipe box. She set out a sign in careful lettering, "The Caldwell Lending Library, open to all residents." Gerald Pratt came in person to inform her that operating a library required a license from the town council. Adelaide showed him the relevant section of the Kansas state statutes, which she had spent an evening reading at the town recorder's office, which stated clearly that a private lending library on private property required no such license. He stood in the doorway of her back room with his hat in his hands and his dignity compressed into a very small space, and then he left without saying anything further. Mrs. Thacker came in the next morning and said, "I saw Gerald Pratt's face when he came out of here yesterday. It looked like a man who has bitten a lemon and cannot decide whether to spit it out or swallow it." Adelaide laughed. She laughed properly, without managing it, and it felt very good. Matthew came in on a Thursday evening when the store was closed and found her at the back shelving new arrivals. He brought supper from the boarding house kitchen, wrapped in cloth, because he had been told by Mrs. Elgin, who ran the boarding house, that Miss Bailey forgot to eat when she was busy, and that someone ought to remind her. "Did Mrs. Elgin send you?" Adelaide said, not displeased. "She provided the food," he said carefully. "Coming here was my idea." They ate at the work table with the lamp between them, and Adelaide told him about the library's first week and the look on Gerald Pratt's face, and Matthew listened with that full attention of his and laughed at the right moments and asked the right questions, and somewhere in the middle of all of it Adelaide understood something about him that she had been moving toward for weeks. He was not interested in her despite her dreams. He was interested in her because of them. The plans and the proposals and the lending library and the writing, all the things she had been told, were evidence of her unsuitability and impracticality. Those were precisely the things that held his attention. He looked at her enthusiasm the way some people look at a landscape, with pleasure and the desire to keep looking. She did not know what to do with that. She had been formed partly by years of being told to be less, and being told to be less leaves marks, and those marks did not simply disappear because one person looked at her differently. But she held the feeling carefully, like something that might be real. The letter from Margaret Hoskins arrived in the second week of June. She was interested. She had her certificate. She had her experience. She had been teaching in a Wichita schoolroom for 3 years and found herself wanting something newer. She wanted to know more about the situation and the salary and the schoolhouse. Adelaide sat down and wrote her the most honest letter she had ever composed. She described the feed store schoolroom in full and unsparing detail. She described the 42 children and the grain smell and the mice. She described the 30 women of Caldwell who had quietly told her, in ones and twos over the past month, that they thought a proper school was necessary and right. She described her plans for the school board petition. She did not oversell anything, because she believed Margaret Hoskins deserved the truth and could make her own decision based on it. Then she went to see Matthew. He was not at the store because it was a Sunday, so she rode out to the Hartley range house for the first time, on the old mare she had borrowed from the livery, sitting in the saddle with the determined posture of someone who is technically capable of something but not entirely comfortable with it. The range house was a solid structure of whitewashed plank 7 miles north on land that rolled slightly toward the creek, with a bunkhouse off to one side and corrals that were well kept. Several hands were working in the corrals when she rode up, and they paused and looked at her with interest. Matthew came out of the range house at the sound of the horse. He stopped when he saw her. Then he came forward with his hat already in his hand. "Adelaide," he said, "is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said. "I wanted to show you this." She held out Margaret Hoskins' letter. He read it standing in the yard with the June sun on him and the prairie wind lifting the edge of the paper. When he finished he looked up and his expression was the one she was coming to know, the warm and precise one that meant he was pleased about something. "She sounds right," he said. "She does," Adelaide said. "I'm going to write back and ask her to come for a visit. I want the school board petition ready before she arrives so she can see that I have a plan." She paused. "I want to ask something of you." "Ask," he said. "I need names," she said. "People on the petition. I have Mrs. Thacker and the families of about 20 children so far, but I need someone the council views as credible, which in this town means a man with property and standing." She said it plainly without bitterness because it was simply true. "You own the management of the Hartley Range, which gives you standing, and you've been here long enough to be known at least a little. Would you sign the petition?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she could not entirely read. "I'll do more than sign it," he said. "If you write the petition, I'll take it around the Hartley property and the neighboring ranches. The cattlemen around here have children too. Most of them would like a proper school." She stared at him. "That would change everything." "That's the idea," he said. She smiled at him, a full and unguarded smile that she felt across her whole face, and he looked at her with that expression again, the one she could not entirely read but was beginning to be able to feel, which was different. "Come inside," he said. "Mrs. Calloway makes coffee that is worth making the ride for." She followed him into the range house, and the hands in the corral watched this with expressions of various kinds. And the oldest one, a weathered man named Pete who had worked the Hartley land for 12 years, remarked quietly to nobody in particular that it was about time Matthew Langston found someone who could keep up with him, because that was not easy and everybody knew it. The summer moved in that particular way that summers in Kansas have of moving, which is fast when you are busy and slow when you are hot, and Adelaide was both. The lending library grew to 140 books. The petition gathered 63 names from town and 32 from the surrounding ranches. Margaret Hoskins wrote 3 more letters, each one warmer and more specific, and agreed to come to Caldwell in August to meet the school board. Matthew came into town twice a week without fail, and these were ostensibly supply runs, but had become something else that neither of them had put a name to yet, which everyone else in Caldwell had noticed even if the two of them were being careful about it. Mrs. Thacker told Adelaide directly, one morning in July while helping rearrange the library shelves, "That man is courting you." "He has not said so," Adelaide said. "He does not have to say so," Mrs. Thacker said, in the tone of a woman who has seen a great deal of life. "A man who rides 14 miles round trip twice a week to carry supplies from a store he could send a hand for his courting. The supplies are incidental." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, pressing a book spine into place. "I don't know what to do with it," she said, and it was true, and she was glad she was saying it to Dora Thacker and not to someone less trustworthy. "What do you want to do with it?" Mrs. Thacker said. "I want to be careful," Adelaide said. "I have built something here. The store, the library, the petition, my writing. I have things that belong to me. I am not willing to put them down for anyone." "Who said you would have to?" Mrs. Thacker said. Adelaide did not answer, because the answer was complicated and had to do with everything she had observed about the way marriage tended to work in 1878 in Kansas, which was that the things belonging to women tended to become things belonging to their husbands, legally and practically, and in every other way. It was not individual men who created this. It was the structure they all lived inside, and the structure was not kind to women who wanted things of their own. "What do you know about him?" she said instead. "I know what Mrs. Elgin says," Mrs. Thacker said, "which is that he is quiet and pays his board on time and is never disagreeable and reads in the evenings, which she considers civilized. And I know what I see, which is a man who listens to you. In my experience, that is rarer than it ought to be." Adelaide thought about this for 3 days. She thought about it while measuring flour and filling supply orders and cataloging new library donations, and writing the 3rd draft of her piece about the women who had built Caldwell without anyone writing about it, which the Chicago Journal had requested as a follow-up. She thought about it late at night with the lamp burning and the coyotes calling and the prairie outside her window dark and enormous and full of whatever it was full of. On a Thursday in mid-July, Matthew came in at closing time with a specific look on his face, which was the look of a man who has decided something and is not yet sure of the ground. "Adelaide," he said. "Matthew," she said. They were standing in the store proper, between the flour barrels and the calico bolts, with the last of the afternoon light coming through the front window and turning everything warm. "I would like to take you to supper on Sunday," he said. "Not as a supply run. As something that is its own thing and is called what it is." She looked at him. "Are you asking to court me?" "Yes," he said, "I am." She put her hands flat on the counter. "I need you to know something first," she said. "I am not a woman who will put aside what she is building, the library, the writing, the school petition. These are not hobbies I will set down when they become inconvenient. They are what I am doing with my life, and I intend to keep doing it." "I know that," he said. "And I need more than your word that you know it," she said, not harshly but clearly. "I need to understand what you actually think about a woman who has her own work." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating but considering, in the way she had come to recognize as the difference in him. He did not say things quickly to smooth things over. He said them when he had thought about them. "My mother," he said, "ran the entire operational accounts for my father's ranch in Texas for 22 years. She negotiated with suppliers and she tracked every head of cattle, and she knew that land better than anyone on it. Her name was never on anything. The law did not allow it, but the work was hers and the knowledge was hers, and she never stopped, and my father never asked her to." He paused. "She died when I was 16. I watched her work herself into the ground for a life and an enterprise that was legally invisible to her. I made a decision then about what I thought about that." Adelaide was very still. "What decision?" "That any woman I spent my life with was going to spend it as herself," he said. "Not as a version of herself that had been made smaller to fit inside the space I occupied." The light in the store was warm and the flour barrels smelled of dust and grain, and the sign above the library door said the Caldwell Lending Library in her own handwriting. And Adelaide Bailey stood in the life she was building and looked at Matthew Langston and felt something that had no comfortable name settle fully and permanently into her chest. "Sunday supper," she said. "Sunday supper," he said. He put his hat on. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back and looked at her one more time with those green eyes, and what was in them was perfectly clear now. She could read it completely, and it was everything she thought it was, and it was also, she realized with a slight shock, very much reflected in herself. "Good evening, Adelaide," he said. "Good evening, Matthew," she said. He went out into the July evening, and she stood in her store and did something she had not done in quite some time, which was stand completely still in the middle of her life and let herself be very, very glad. Sunday supper was at the hotel dining room, which was the nicest eating establishment in Caldwell, with white tablecloths that were only slightly yellow from too many washings, and a cook named Ferdinand who made a beef stew that people rode into town for. They sat across from each other with the room full of other diners, and Adelaide wore the blue dress she had been saving for occasions that felt significant, and Matthew wore a clean shirt and a jacket that she suspected he had acquired specifically because she had been saving the blue dress. They talked for 3 hours. The stew got cold. They talked about Texas and Kansas and the particular difference in the quality of light between them. They talked about books and discovered that he had read more than she had expected, and she had read more than he had expected, and that they had 3 novels in common and several strong opinions that aligned and 2 that did not, which led to a productive argument about the proper ending of a specific Dickens novel that neither of them resolved but both of them enjoyed. He told her more about his years on the cattle drives. The Kishom Trail was real work, unglamorous and dusty and monotonous for long stretches with sudden moments of genuine danger, and he spoke about it without either bragging or dramatizing, just as a man describing work he had known. He told her about the men he had worked alongside, the full range of them, the skilled and the careless and the occasionally brilliant, men from Texas and Mexico and freed slaves who had come west after the war looking for a different kind of life. He spoke about all of them with the same respect, which she noticed. She told him about her father, about the way Silas Bailey had built his store and his life in this town from nearly nothing, arriving in Caldwell in 1869 when it was barely a smudge on the prairie, and how he had believed in the place when it would have been reasonable not to. She told him about her father's belief in her, the specific and consistent belief that she could do whatever she put her mind to, which had been the most important thing she had ever been given and also the most painful to have taken away by his death. "He would have liked you," she said, which surprised her as it came out because she had not planned to say it. Matthew was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" "You listen the same way he did," she said. "Like what someone says matters enough to actually hear." He looked at her across the white tablecloth with the lamp between them and said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him, "Adelaide, I want you to know that what I feel for you is not a new thing. It has been building since the first morning you shook my hand across that counter. She breathed carefully. How long ago was that? 4 months, he said. Give or take. That is not very long, she said. No, he said. But some things you know even when it's not very long. I don't think length of time is the reliable measure people claim it is. She thought about Daniel Westcott, whom she had known for 2 years before he told her to stop dreaming. She thought about how long time was not protection against the wrong thing. She thought about 4 months of twice-weekly visits and wheelbarrows and shelves and petitions and supper being brought because someone knew she forgot to eat. I feel the same, she said quietly. I want to be honest about that. I also want to be honest that I am cautious about what it means, about the practical dimensions of it. The property, he said. He was not slow. Among other things, she said. The store is mine. The library is mine. My writing is mine. Under the law as it currently stands, if I were to marry, those would become yours, he said. I will put it in writing if you want. I will hire a lawyer in Wichita and have papers drawn up that specify the store and everything connected to it remains entirely in your name regardless of any other arrangement. She stared at him. That is not commonly done. I don't care about common, he said. I care about right. She sat with that. The dining room moved around them with its quiet clatter of cutlery and conversation, and she sat with the idea of Matthew Langston as a man who would put things in writing not because he was afraid of his own intentions, but because he understood that her caution was reasonable and deserved a concrete answer. Let's not talk about lawyers tonight, she said finally. Let's just have supper. He smiled. All right. But I did not say no to the rest of it, she said. I noticed, he said, and the smile in his eyes was warm enough to feel. August arrived with the fullness that August has in Kansas, which is hot and golden and relentless. Margaret Hoskins came to Caldwell on the 3rd of August on the afternoon train, a small sharp-eyed woman of 31 who shook Adelaide's hand with a grip that said she meant business. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following day. Adelaide had the petition. She had 63 town signatures and 32 ranch signatures, and she had Matthew Langston sitting in the front row of the meeting room, which she had not asked him to do, but which she was aware of in a way that was both strengthening and warming. She stood up in front of Gerald Pratt and his 2 agreeable colleagues, and she presented the petition, and she presented Margaret Hoskins, and she presented the curriculum outline she had developed over 6 months of careful work. She was steady and clear and precise, and she did not wait for laughter because she had stopped expecting it from everyone, and she made her case. Gerald Pratt looked at the 95 signatures, and then at Margaret Hoskins' certificate, and then at Adelaide's curriculum outline with its 217 neatly handwritten points. And something happened in his expression that was not exactly defeat, but was adjacent to it, which was the recognition that the momentum was no longer in his direction. He said they would need to deliberate. They deliberated for 40 minutes while Adelaide and Margaret and Matthew and Mrs. Thacker and about 30 other interested citizens waited in the anteroom drinking the coffee that someone had had the foresight to bring. The board approved the petition. They approved Margaret Hoskins as the teacher. They approved a budget for the schoolhouse construction, small but real. Adelaide sat very still for a moment after the announcement with her hands in her lap and her eyes looking at the middle distance. Matthew, sitting beside her, said quietly, Adelaide. I know, she said. She exhaled. I know. Mrs. Thacker, on her other side, put a hand over hers and squeezed once. Margaret Hoskins, who had been composed and professional throughout, permitted herself a single moment of very visible relief. The schoolhouse was started in September. Adelaide supervised the construction with the same attention she brought to the store accounts, which was absolute, and the men hired for the work discovered quickly that she knew exactly what she wanted and was not interested in shortcuts. The building went up in 6 weeks, and it was solid and light, and had 17 proper desks that Matthew had arranged to have made by the carpenter in Wellington who did good work. On the day it opened, Adelaide stood in the doorway and watched 42 children file in with their slates and their readers, and find a seat at a proper desk in a proper room that smelled of new wood and chalk instead of grain and mice, and she thought that this was what it felt like when a dream became a thing you could stand inside. Matthew was there. He had ridden in that morning specifically to be there. He stood beside her in the doorway and said nothing, because nothing was needed. After a while she said, "My mother used to say that I would wear myself out wanting things that weren't mine to want." "What do you think?" he said. She looked at the schoolroom. She thought about the library, which now had 191 books and was open 4 days a week, and had regular visitors including 3 men who had previously said they saw no use for it. She thought about the 2 pieces published in the Chicago Journal and the third requested and already half-written. She thought about the petition and the 95 signatures and the curriculum and the look on Gerald Pratt's face. "I think my mother was worried about me," she said. "And that love sometimes looks like caution, but I think she was wrong." He put his hand over hers where it rested on the doorframe. It was the first time he had touched her beyond a handshake, and it was deliberate and gentle, and she did not move her hand. "You were never wrong to want things," he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't." They stood in the schoolhouse doorway in the October morning with the Kansas autumn coming gold across the prairie and the sound of 42 children settling into their first proper school day, and Adelaide turned her hand over under his and held it. He looked down at their hands and then up at her. She looked back at him. "Matthew," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not finished being cautious," she said. "I know that too," he said. "But I believe you," she said. "What you told me about your mother, about what you decided, I believe it." "All right," he said. "So stop being patient," she said. "If you have something to say, say it." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was neither his customary steadiness nor the warmth she knew from the lamplit evenings. It was something that had been held very carefully for a long time and was now being released carefully. "Adelaide Bailey," he said, "I would like to ask you, formally and properly, to marry me. With the understanding that the store is yours, and the library is yours, and your writing is yours, and that I would no more ask you to put those down than I would ask the prairie to be smaller than it is. I have spoken to a lawyer in Wichita already. The papers exist. The store and any connected property will remain solely in your name regardless of what comes after. All I am asking for is the chance to stand next to you while you do everything you are going to do." She was quiet for a moment. Around them the October morning was blue and gold, and the school was full of children's voices for the first time in the right kind of building, and the prairie went on in every direction as far as the eye could handle. "Yes," she said, "that is my answer." He exhaled, and she saw that he had been less certain than he appeared, which was one of the things she loved about him, that under the steadiness there was a man who could still be uncertain about the things that mattered. "That's my answer too," he said, which did not quite make grammatical sense, but she understood him completely. She laughed. He did too. They stood in the schoolhouse doorway in October 1878 and laughed, and Margaret Hoskins, who had been watching from inside the classroom while pretending to organize chalk, later told Mrs. Thacker that it was the best thing she had seen in a considerable time. They were married in November, on a day that was cold and clear with a high blue sky, in the half-finished church that had been finished enough by then to hold the ceremony comfortably. Mrs. Thacker was there and Margaret Hoskins was there, and the Hartley hands were there, and 60 people from town and the surrounding ranches, more than either of them had expected, and Gerald Pratt attended because refusing the invitation would have looked worse, and because somewhere under his stiffness he knew that things were changing and that Adelaide Bailey was part of that change whether he preferred it or not. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself from ivory wool, practical for November but beautiful in the way that practical and beautiful are not actually opposites. Matthew wore the suit he had made in Wichita during one of his trips there on library and lawyer business, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that was so entirely open and full that half the women in the church found their own eyes unexpectedly warm. Reverend Clay read the words. Matthew said his with a steadiness that was his own. Adelaide said hers with a clarity that was hers. And when it was done and they were standing in the cold November air outside the church, with everyone around them and the prairie going gold under the low sun, Adelaide looked at the man she had married and felt no sense of diminishment, no sense of something ending. She felt the opposite of that. She felt like someone who had been walking a long distance and had found, not a stopping place, but a traveling companion. Matthew put his hand on her face very gently. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. The winter settled in around Caldwell with its particular prairie character, which is wide and cold and full of wind that finds every gap in every wall. And Adelaide and Matthew occupied the house she had been renting next to the store, which they now rented together with the option to purchase, which they exercised in February using a combination of her store income and his Hartley salary. The papers were signed in both their names, which required some negotiation at the land office and which Adelaide handled with a thoroughness that left no room for argument. She ran the store. She ran the library. She wrote 3 more pieces for the Chicago Journal and received a letter from an editor in St. Louis who had read them and wanted to publish a collection of her essays on life in the Kansas frontier, which she agreed to with a steadiness that concealed the fact that she sat down quite abruptly when she finished reading the letter. Matthew told her to sit down as much as she needed to. He read the letter 4 times. He said St. Louis, as if it were a point he was marking on a map of the things he knew to be important. She said, "It is a very respectable publisher." "I know it is," he said. "I am trying to express that I am proud of you without sounding like I have a right to be proud of you when it is entirely your accomplishment." She looked at him across the table. "You can be proud of me," she said. "I am proud of you. That is what people who love each other do. It's not ownership, it's participation." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very precise way to put it." "I am a writer," she said. "Precision is the work." He smiled that full smile of his and leaned across the table and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And outside the February wind went about its business against the Kansas sky. And inside the Bailey house on the edge of Caldwell, it was warm. Spring returned, and with it the cattle drives and the noise and the money and the dust that meant Caldwell was alive and doing what it did. The schoolhouse completed its first full year with 47 students, 5 more than had started. Margaret Hoskins sent a letter to the State Board of Education about the school's progress and received a favorable mention in a report that reached the governor's office, which meant that Caldwell was on record as having a proper educational institution, which Adelaide thought was worth more than the mention itself. The library expanded to a second room. This required the removal of a wall between the original back room and a storage closet, which Matthew accomplished on a Saturday in April with a hammer and a cheerful disregard for dust, and they argued companionably about the best way to do it, and ended up with a room twice the size they had started with, and a fine coating of plaster dust on both of them that took 3 days to get out of their hair. The collection grew to over 400 volumes by summer. People came from neighboring towns to use it. A woman from a farm 8 miles south made the trip once a week without fail, returning and selecting with a regularity and seriousness that Adelaide found deeply gratifying. In June, Adelaide discovered she was expecting their first child, which she worked out from the calendar and confirmed with the town's doctor, Dr. Anselm Briggs, who was a careful man and said everything was proceeding as it should. She told Matthew that evening after supper, sitting on the porch they had added to the house in the spring, with the June prairie going warm and sweet around them. He looked at her for a long moment. "Adelaide," he said, and his voice was different, full in a way she had not heard before. "June or July of next year," she said. He put his hands over hers in his lap, holding them carefully as if she were something he was very aware of being trusted with. "Are you all right?" he said. "With everything, the store, the writing, all of it?" "I intend to keep all of it," she said, "the same as before." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to be sure you knew," she said. "Adelaide," he said, "we have been married 6 months. I have never once said anything that suggested I would want you to stop." "You have not," she said, "but I wanted to say it out loud anyway, for myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Say it out loud as many times as you need." She leaned into him, her shoulder against his, and they sat on the porch in the June evening with the prairie spreading out around them and the town quiet behind them, and the future taking a new shape that was larger than it had been a day ago. And it was good. The collection of essays was published in early winter of 1879 by the St. Louis House, under the title Prairie Women, Voices from the Kansas Frontier, with Adelaide Bailey Langston credited as author. She held the first copy in the back room of the store, the library room, surrounded by 462 books, and the smell of wood and paper, and the faint distant trace of her father's pipe tobacco in the walls. And she thought about the town meeting in the spring of 1878, where she had stood up and been laughed at. She thought about Gerald Pratt and the word dreamer, said the way you say something small about something smaller. She thought about Matthew, who had been in the back of that room and who had listened, and who had walked into her store 4 days later and shaken her hand. She held the book with both hands and let herself have that, all of it, the full weight of it. Matthew came in from the store where he had been helping the clerk they had recently hired, a young woman named Polly who was sharp and capable and learning the business with gratifying speed. He saw Adelaide's face and came and stood beside her and looked at the book. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the library room with the book between them. And outside the Kansas, winter was settling in for its long work. And inside the Caldwell Lending Library, which had started with 41 books in a cleared storage room, everything was warm and properly shelved and full. Their son was born in February of 1880, in the house next to the store, with Dr. Briggs in attendance, and Mrs. Thacker planted firmly in the kitchen making strong tea and being generally indispensable. Matthew was there throughout, in the way that men of the time were not always permitted to be, but he was not a man who could be argued away from something when he had decided to be present, and he had decided to be present, and Dr. Briggs was sensible enough to see the value of a steady, calm person in the room. The child was born healthy and loud and ferociously alive, which everyone took as a good sign. They named him Silas James Langston, Silas for Adelaide's father and James for Matthew's, and he arrived in the world with green eyes and an expression of absolute opinion that both his parents recognized immediately. Matthew held him with that careful steadiness of his, the same way he held everything that mattered. Adelaide, lying back in the pillows with the particular tiredness of someone who has done a significant piece of work, watched the two of them and thought that this was also a dream she had not known she was having, and here it was, specific and warm and real. Mrs. Thacker came in with tea and looked at the three of them and said, "Well, that is satisfactory," which from Dora Thacker was equivalent to a standing ovation. Life in 1880 Caldwell continued with the texture that characterized the late frontier period, busy and unpredictable and moving toward something that was not quite settled yet. The cattle drives continued. The town grew. New families arrived and new businesses opened, and the argument about what kind of place Caldwell wanted to be was ongoing and frequently loud, and Adelaide was in the middle of it more often than not. She served on the library board, which she had formalized with a proper charter, and 3 board members including Mrs. Thacker and the schoolteacher Margaret Hoskins, and eventually, improbably, a reformed Gerald Pratt, who had arrived at the library one afternoon with his granddaughter, and discovered that the child was fascinated by the books on natural science and had come back every week since, so that now he had a personal stake in the institution he had once tried to prevent. Adelaide did not remark on this. She simply added his name to the board when he asked, and moved on, which was its own kind of grace. She wrote a second collection. This one focused specifically on the cattle industry from the perspective of the people who worked it, and the towns it built, and the women who ran those towns' essential services while the men got the newspaper coverage. It was more directly political than the first book, and the St. Louis publisher was more cautious about it. But it was published in 1881 and sold well enough to earn a third printing, which Adelaide found quietly astonishing every time she thought about it. The Kansas state legislature passed a Limited Women's Property Rights Act in 1880, one of the early forward movements on the issue, which allowed married women to own and operate businesses in their own names without their husband's legal signature for certain categories of transactions. Adelaide read the legislation twice when it arrived in the newspaper, and then sat down and wrote an editorial for the Caldwell newspaper, which the editor, a man named Briggs who was not the doctor but was his cousin and equally sensible, published on the front page. Gerald Pratt read it and said, in front of several witnesses at the general store, that while he did not agree with everything Miss Bailey, that is, Mrs. Langston, wrote, he could not deny that she had a clear head for the things she applied it to. This was repeated throughout the town and reached Adelaide the following day, and she said to Matthew, "I believe that is the nicest thing Gerald Pratt has ever said about me." Matthew said, "It is also the most accurate." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, and they laughed in their kitchen while Silas, now walking and already showing a strong preference for being in the middle of whatever the adults were doing, held onto the table leg and contributed his own opinion in the wordless but emphatic language of 14-month-olds. Matthew's work at the Hartley Ranch expanded. He was now managing the full operation, not just the section he had been hired for originally, because it turned out that a man who could read pressure points and deal with them before they became problems was useful in the cattle business, and the Hartley Company paid him accordingly. He had a good relationship with the men who worked under him, based on the straightforward principle of treating people as if their work mattered and their skill deserved recognition, which was not universal in the cattle industry, and which his hands found unusual and then valuable, and then something they would not have traded for a different employer. He hired men based on competence and character without regard to origin, which on the Kansas frontier in 1880 meant his crew included men from Texas, and men from Mexico, and men from the eastern states who had come west for various reasons, and 2 black cowboys who had both been working cattle since they were boys, and were as skilled as any man he had worked with. There was grumbling from some quarters about this arrangement, and Matthew dealt with the grumbling with the same calm precision he brought to everything, which was to say he listened to it once and said clearly what his standard was, and that was the end of the conversation. Adelaide wrote about his crew, with their permission, in an essay for a Kansas City journal that was trying to build a readership among working people. The essay was called "The Men of the Range," a portrait of the working cowboy in Kansas, and it was the piece she was proudest of technically, because it required her to do something she had not done before, which was to write about people she knew well without making them objects of her observation, to write with them rather than about them, and she had had to learn how to do that, and it had taken 3 drafts. Matthew read it when it was published and said, "You got Hector right." Hector was the oldest hand on the Hartley crew, the man who had commented at the beginning about Matthew needing someone who could keep up with him, who was 61 years old and had been working cattle for 40 years, and had opinions about everything and a gift for finding water in dry country that was, as far as anyone could tell, essentially mystical. "Hector is easy to get right," Adelaide said. "He is exactly who he presents himself as being." "Yes," Matthew said, "but it is not easy to put that on paper so another person can see it. You did." She looked at him across the supper table. Silas was asleep. The evening was quiet. "You know," she said, "you are the only person who has ever said that about my writing, that it does a specific thing well, not just that it is good or that you are proud of it, but what it does." "I read carefully," he said. "I know you do," she said. I am saying it matters, that kind of reading, it matters to the person who wrote the thing. He understood her as he usually did. All right, he said, I will keep telling you what the work does. Yes, she said, please. The second child arrived in the spring of 1882, a girl they named Clara Rose Langston, and Adelaide was aware of the irony of the name Clara, given that Daniel Westcott had married a Clara in Topeka. But the name was Matthew's grandmother's name, and Adelaide loved it on its own terms, so Clara she was. Clara was different from Sela's from the beginning, quieter and more watchful, with Adelaide's brown eyes and Matthew's capacity for stillness, a combination that produced a child who could observe a room for 20 minutes before deciding what she thought about it, which Dr. Briggs said was perfectly healthy, and Mrs. Thacker said was perfectly sensible. Adelaide nursed her in the back room of the store while cataloging new library editions, which was a form of multitasking that she was not sure anyone had attempted before, but which worked reasonably well. Matthew came and found her there one afternoon and stood in the doorway of the library room looking at his wife and his daughter and the shelves of books in the afternoon light through the window, and his expression was the one that had no name, the one that was simply the whole of what he felt, undivided and clear. Come in or stay out, Adelaide said without looking up from her catalog. You are letting in the draft. He came in. He sat on the stool, which was still the same stool from 3.5 years ago when they had first talked properly across the work table. He watched her work. Do you remember, she said, still writing, asking me to tell you every single dream I had? I do, he said. In this room, she said. Yes, he said. She set down her pen and looked at him with the baby on her arm and the catalog open on the table, and 460 books around them, and her name on 2 published volumes, and the town that had laughed at her now, using the library she had built in the back of her father's store. I want to tell you one more, she said. That I did not say that day because I did not have it yet. He waited. This one, she said. This is the one I did not know to dream. He was very still for a moment. Then he moved off the stool and came and sat beside her on the bench she kept against the wall, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Clara made a small soft sound between them, and the afternoon held them in it, warm and complete. The years that followed were the years of building. The schoolhouse expanded in 1883 to accommodate 70 students, and a second teacher was hired, a young man fresh from the normal school, who Margaret Hoskins trained with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The library moved to its own dedicated building in 1884, a small but proper structure on the corner of Main and Creek Road, built by public subscription, with a sign over the door in Adelaide's handwriting that had been carved into wood by the carpenter from Wellington. The Caldwell Public Lending Library, founded 1878. The founding year was important to her. She wanted it on the record. Gerald Pratt attended the dedication ceremony, which was in October, with the autumn coming gold across the prairie and the whole town there in their good clothes. He made a short speech in which he said that the library was a credit to Caldwell and to the vision of those who had believed in it from the beginning, and he looked at Adelaide when he said it, which the whole crowd saw, and which Adelaide accepted with a nod that was neither cold nor effusive but was simply gracious, which was all it needed to be. Matthew watched the ceremony from the side of the crowd, with Sela's on his shoulders because the 4-year-old could not see over the adults, and Clara on his hip because she was 2, and had decided she preferred being carried to walking, which she announced by sitting down firmly on the ground every time her preference was not accommodated. He watched Adelaide stand in front of the building she had dreamed into existence and accept the acknowledgement of the town she had built something for, and he thought what he had thought at intervals for 5 years now, which was that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and also that he was the luckiest man in Caldwell, which he was aware was not an objective measurement but which he held to nonetheless. Sela's from his perch on Matthew's shoulders said, With the authority of a 4-year-old who has been raised in a house full of books and opinions, Mama made the library. She did, Matthew said. I like the library, Silas said. So do I, Matthew said. It has the book about horses, Silas said. It has many books about horses, Matthew said. That is good, Silas said, with deep satisfaction, and watched his mother accept a bunch of autumn flowers from the mayor with the solemn expression of someone who has decided that this particular moment is appropriate and important, which it was. Adelaide's third book was published in 1885 by a New York house this time, which was larger and more prominent than the St. Louis publisher, and which meant that her name appeared in some of the Eastern newspapers in favorable reviews. The book was called Women of the Frontier, the hidden work of building the West, and it was the most ambitious thing she had written. 3 years of work and 27 subjects and 700 miles of research conducted through letters and 2 trips, one to Wichita and one to Dodge City, both of which Matthew accompanied her on because the children were old enough to be left with Mrs. Thacker for a week, and because traveling together turned out to be something they were both very good at. They argued about hotel choices in Wichita and agreed about the best breakfast food in Dodge City, and discovered a shared capacity for getting lost in cities they did not know and finding their way back by the simple method of Matthew's direction sense and Adelaide's willingness to ask strangers. And they arrived home from each trip tired and happy in a way that was different from the tiredness of ordinary work, the tiredness of having done something together. The New York reviews called the book important. The St. Louis reviews called it provocative. The Kansas newspapers were divided on it. Adelaide read all the reviews once and then put them away because reviews were useful information and nothing more, and she had the next project already begun, a novel this time, a large and difficult and probably foolish undertaking which she was certain about. She told Matthew about it on a summer evening in 1885 on the porch with Silas 5 and Clara 3 and both of them theoretically asleep inside. A novel, he said. A long one, she said, about this place. A woman who comes to Kansas in the 60s before the cattle trade and builds a life in the years before the town is quite real. I have the first 3 chapters in my head. I have had them for years. Why haven't you written it before? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Because I was afraid, she said, which is ridiculous given everything. It is not ridiculous, he said. Fear of the big thing is different from fear of the little thing. It makes sense. She looked at him. I am going to tell you something that is going to sound either very foolish or very logical depending on how you hear it. Tell me, he said. I could not have written it before, she said. Not because of time or resources or anything external, because I did not know yet what I know now, about staying, about choosing to stay somewhere and build something. The woman in the novel knows things I did not know when I was 24 and standing up in a town meeting being laughed at. She paused. I know them now. He was looking at her with that expression, the full open one. Write it, he said. I intend to, she said. Good, he said, and then after a moment, what does she know, this woman? Adelaide looked out at the prairie evening, at the darkening gold of the sky, and the first stars coming in, and the grass moving in the long, slow way it moved in summer. And she thought about what the woman in the novel knew, and about what she herself had learned in 7 years of building and loving and choosing and staying. That being seen is different from being agreed with, she said. That the right person for you is not the one who tells you that you are right about everything. It is the one who looks at what you are doing and takes it seriously enough to engage with it, seriously enough to argue about it when they think you are wrong. Have I told you that you are wrong about things? He said. Several times, she said. About the best route to Wichita twice. About how long the library expansion would take once. About whether Silas needed to see Dr. Briggs about that cough, which I maintain I was right about and you were being cautious. I was right about Silas, he said. You were, she said. But I appreciate being on the list, he said. She laughed, and he laughed, and inside the house one of the children made a sound that suggested they were not quite as asleep as they had been claimed to be, and Matthew went in to investigate and came back with Clara on his shoulder, who had apparently decided that the evening was too interesting to miss. They sat on the porch, the three of them, while the Kansas summer night came in full and warm and full of cricket sound, and Adelaide held her daughter and watched her husband lean back in the chair beside her with his face turned up to the stars that were arriving in number now, the great spread of them that you could only see properly from flat country, and she thought, I have everything I dared to want, and then some things I did not know to want, and all of it is here and real and mine. The novel took 4 years to write. It was not 4 years of uninterrupted writing, because life in Caldwell in the 1880s was not arranged to allow uninterrupted anything. There were the children and the store and the library and the school board and the town and the prairie winters and the cattle drives and the various events and emergencies and ordinary pleasures that made up a life in a real place. She wrote in the early mornings before the children were awake, and in the evenings after they were in bed, and on Sunday afternoons while Matthew read in the chair across the sitting room and the house was quiet around them. She gave him chapters as she finished them. This had not been planned but had developed naturally from the fact that he was her most careful reader, not her most forgiving one, which was important, and because she trusted his instincts about people, which were good, and because it turned out that reading her work aloud to him in the evenings was something she loved, the way the words sounded different in air than on paper, the way his attention shaped her understanding of what she had written. He told her when something was not right and why, and she did not always agree and they argued about it, and sometimes she changed it and sometimes she did not, and the work was better for all of it. The novel was finished in the fall of 1889 and published by the New York House the following spring. It was called Prairie Born, and it was dedicated to two people, Adelaide Bailey, who told her she could, and Matthew Langston, who asked her to tell him everything. She showed him the dedication page in the library room, the original back room of the store where they had first had the conversation, standing in the same light that had been there in 1878, though the room was larger now, and the books were different books, and she was 35 and he was 39, and Caldwell had grown into something that was becoming a proper town in the full sense. He read the dedication and was quiet for a moment. I only asked you once, he said. You only needed to ask once, she said. He looked at the page and then at her, and what was in his face was everything it had always been, clear and full and taking nothing for granted. Adelaide Bailey Langston, he said, you have built something that is going to last longer than either of us. She took the book back from him and looked at it. The cover was plain, just the title and her name. She had requested that. She had not wanted anything on the outside that would oversell what was inside, because what was inside could stand on its own. We, she said. He looked at her. We have built something, she said. The library has your shelves in it. The school petition has your name on it and your rides to the ranches in it. The essays have your crew in them and your sense of what matters. The children, she paused. Everything I have made you have been part of the making, not because you built it for me, because you made it possible to be entirely myself while building it. That is different and it is not nothing, and I want you to know I know it. He was very still. I know it, she said quietly. I always knew it. He crossed the room in 2 steps and held her with a care and a completeness that was 11 years deep, and she held him back the same way, and the library was quiet around them with its books and its window, and its long history of being the place where things that mattered had been said. The novel was praised. It was reviewed in the major Eastern papers as a significant work of American frontier literature. It was reviewed in Kansas as a work of particular local importance. It was read in Caldwell, most copies of which were borrowed from the lending library she had founded 12 years ago, and which now had over 1,000 volumes. Margaret Hoskins, who was still teaching, who had become one of Adelaide's closest friends over the dozen years since she had arrived in Caldwell with her certificate and her cents, wrote her a letter that said simply, "You told the truth of this place. That is the rarest and most necessary thing. Gerald Pratt died in the winter of 1890 at 73 and was given a proper funeral at the church, which was fully finished by then. Adelaide attended and sat near the front. She had not forgiven him for 1878 in the simple sense, because she had not needed to. Forgiveness of that kind being more about releasing a weight than about changing the past, and she had released the weight a long time ago. What she felt at the service was something closer to the recognition that a person can start in one place and end in another, and that the library board seat and the granddaughter who came every week for the natural science books were part of what Gerald Pratt actually was, as much as the laughter in the meeting room had been. She thought about what she would write about him someday, and decided it would be honest, which was all she had ever aimed for. Silas was 10 in 1890 and Clara was 8, and there was a third child now, a boy named Thomas William Langston, who had arrived in 1887, and who was 3 and universally described as a force of nature, which was meant partly as a warning and partly as a compliment, both of which his parents accepted with the equanimity of people who have already learned that children arrive as themselves, and you simply do your best to keep up. Thomas at 3 had already absorbed the atmosphere of the house with its books and its conversations, and its sense that the world was a place in which you were supposed to have opinions and express them. His opinion at the present time was that horses were the most important subject in existence, and that breakfast should involve more biscuits, both of which he expressed clearly and at length to anyone who would listen, including the library patrons who came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, when Adelaide worked the front desk with Thomas nearby in a designated corner, equipped with board books, and a stuffed horse his father had made for him in Wellington. Matthew watched his 3 children with the same attention he gave everything else, and loved them each specifically, for the particular things they were, which he had decided was the only honest way to love anyone, as the thing they specifically were rather than a general version of what children or people were supposed to be. He had watched Adelaide know this from the beginning, the specific and real way she engaged with everything and everyone. He had learned it partly from watching her. He would not have said so because he did not think it was a lesson he needed to announce, but he thought it regularly. In the spring of 1891, on a morning in April that was clear and warm with the particular quality of early Kansas spring that promises everything, Adelaide was in the library room, which was now officially a separate building, but which she still called the library room out of habit, writing the first pages of what would become her 4th book. Silas was at school. Clara was at school. Thomas was in the yard with Polly, who had risen from store clerk to store manager, and who also served occasional duty as child wrangler, at which she was gifted. Matthew came in from the morning's work at the range house and found Adelaide writing, and did not interrupt her, which was a discipline he had practiced for years and which he was good at. He made coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down at the table and read the newspaper, which arrived from Wichita 2 days behind, so the news was always slightly historical by the time it reached them. But news was news, and the world was interesting regardless. After a while, Adelaide put down her pen and came and poured herself coffee and sat across from him and said, "What does the world say?" "The world says various things," he said, "most of which would be improved by being thought about for 2 days before publication." She smiled. "What else?" "There is an article about the state legislature considering a full women's suffrage bill," he said, "which it will probably not pass this session, but the fact that it is under consideration is different from 5 years ago. 10 years ago you could not have said it in a meeting room without being laughed out," she said. "No," he said. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I have been thinking about getting involved in that," she said. "The suffrage organizing. There is a group in Wichita building toward a campaign, and I know the women running it. 2 of them wrote letters after the 2nd book. "Tell me what that would look like," he said. She told him. It would mean more correspondence and some travel and probably some public speaking, which she was not fond of in the way she was fond of writing but was capable of. It would mean adding to what she was already doing, which was already a great deal. Can you add it without breaking something? He said, which was not a discouragement but a practical question which she heard as such. I think so, she said. If Thomas goes to school in September, which Dr. Briggs says he is ready for, I will have the mornings free, and the store essentially runs itself since Polly took over the day management. Then yes, he said. I haven't asked your opinion on the cause itself, she said. You should have the vote, he said, as if this were obvious, which to him it was. Most men in this state would not say that, she said. Most men in this state are not married to you, he said, which I maintain gives me an advantage in understanding the matter. She looked at him across the breakfast table in the April morning, this man she had been married to for 13 years, who had asked her to tell him every dream she had and had meant it absolutely and had never stopped meaning it. Matthew Langston, she said. Adelaide Langston, he said. I love you, she said. Specifically and entirely. Specifically and entirely, he said. The same. Outside, the April morning was spreading over the prairie in the way it did, opening and golden and enormous. And in the house on the edge of Caldwell, there were books on every surface and children's boots by the door and coffee on the stove and a woman's writing on the table and a man reading the newspaper with his feet up. And everything was exactly what it had become over 13 years of choosing each other and choosing the life they had built. Not the life that had been assumed for them or assigned to them or offered as the reasonable and sensible option, but the specific and particular and entirely their own life that they had made from the ground up, the way you make a thing when you know what it is supposed to be and you are willing to do the work. Adelaide picked up her pen. Matthew turned to the next page of the newspaper. Thomas could be heard in the yard demanding more specific information about horses from Polly, who was handling this with remarkable patience. The prairie went on in every direction as far as the eye could reach, which in Kansas is very far, and the morning was fully itself, and everything that had been built was standing, and the dreams that had been dismissed as foolish were now buildings and books and children and a life. And the cowboy who had stood in the back of a meeting room one spring evening in 1878 and watched a woman hold herself straight, while the room laughed, was now the man at the breakfast table who read her work carefully and told her what it did and argued with her about the route to Wichita and held their children with attention and woke every morning next to the most remarkable person he had ever known, which was an opinion he held without modification and would hold to the end of his days. And Adelaide Bailey Langston, who had been dismissed as a dreamer in a town that did not yet know what she was going to build inside it, wrote the first line of her fourth book in the April morning and felt the world exactly as large as it was, which was large enough for everything she still intended to do, and then some.